Right, awesome. Thank you so much for hopping on this quick video. We're just going to go through a little intro on some of the basics of how to read a chart and really just get you familiar with what you should be ready to learn and be prepared for in our session as we're decoding a little bit about your design. So, when we're looking at human design, we're looking at a synthesis of modern and esoteric traditions. Right out of the gate, you're going to see astrology. That's going to be the obvious that you're most familiar with. And within human design, we're using two different calculations. One is a traditional tropical calculation, which most people using astrology are familiar with. And the second calculation is a stellar Arabian calculation, which is what the Egyptian priesthood used. And that is the second calculation known as the design. Along with that, you see the regular 12 signs that have the 12 houses. Around that are actually the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. And those are actually corresponding to another layer of information. We're not just looking at the sign Aquarius, but now we're looking at, what gate. And then the line of that hexagram, which is another detail of accenting that is describing the particular character quality that you might have in your design. And those 64 gates, which are also, the 64 hexagrams, those are responding to the codons of the DNA. Okay. And so each of those gates has a key. And that's where the gene keys come into play. They're going to unlock those gates. Now, on top of all of that, we're also working with Buddhism, one of the oldest written Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon. There's a teaching called the Anatta, and that is the not self doctrine. And that's also woven into human design. Each of the aura types has a not self theme, each of the centers. And there's all these qualities that express the not self, which in a nutshell is essentially all the beliefs, attitudes, ideas that we have taken on, that we've been programmed by based on the external authority. And that could be parents, other friends, that's TV, society, music, all of these things that program and condition us. Okay, and the Buddha taught essentially that in order to take right action, in order to be liberated and transcend and awaken, we have to take right action in life, which means that we need to establish right mind, which requires we recognize that there is two minds inside of us. One is the true self, and one is the not self. Okay. Another piece here is you see these centers, which look like chakras. Well, we're working with a 9-centered evolutionary chakra system in human design. The 7 chakra system is from an ancient time, and it was prominent to that day and age. But now that we're in the 21st century, now that we're continuing to evolve, life is not static. So we're actually gaining more wisdom, and more energy centers are anchoring themselves into the human aura. Okay. And you could actually liken these to the number of planets that we've discovered, right? So when we had 7 chakras, we were only working with a 7-planet system. And so therefore, when we discover planets beyond that, we anchor new consciousness into our beings. And that's kind of that law of correspondence with the as above, so below principle. Lastly, you also see the tree of life from the Kabbalah. And so these lines, which are these channels essentially, and they're part of different circuit groups, they connect the centers and they create a pathway for life force to flow between these energy centers, establishing a consistent channeling of information. There happens to be 3 circuit groups, another special network called the integration network, and then there's these 36 channels. So depending on the planets that you have, turning on those channels, their positions, whether they're personality or design activated. There's myriad different versions and ways of channeling your life force. So we all have very unique circuitry within ourselves. Now, when we're looking at the chart, there's 2 columns of information on the chart. One of them is a design calculation, the other is a personality calculation. The design is actually what happens when we are in utero. It's primarily most of the journey to coming to life. And these are the codes that essentially program the wisdom of the body, the subconscious framework for how we move through life. It's also the somatic wisdom of the bodily intelligence, the feminine wisdom of the body. And it's the innate intelligence that's built into our form, built into this vessel. And this is calculated 88 degrees reverse of the sun from the moment of birth. This is roughly about 89 days before birth. This is right around the time that the neocortex is fully formed and finished, right? It's like the steering wheel is the thing that gets put in the vehicle right at the end, and you're ready to hop in the vehicle and drive, right? So this is a calculation that's done before birth. This is the stellar Arabian Egyptian priesthood calculation. And this is something that corresponds to the biogenetic nature of the vehicle and is also what you could say is our ancestral inheritance. So this is, because it's a prenatal calculation, this can be information that is in a way connected not only to our ancestral inheritance, but also past life, long-term old soul wisdom, and those things. And then on the other side of that, we have the personality calculation. Okay. This is obviously the mind. This is really where the consciousness begins to inhabit the vehicle. The body gets built first, then the soul comes in. And essentially, this is the soul shard. There's actually something within each design called the Godhead. It's really in an immortal aspect of us that is the consciousness that inhabits the vehicle. Even though the body is mortal, this is something that has an immortal essence to it. And that Godhead is really the consciousness that is thinking up this life and experiencing this life, and really is a shard of God in a way that each and every one of us holds and has as an expression of. This is also the self, quote unquote, that we are conscious of. In a way, this is our identity and our persona. This is why this is our personality. It's the who we think we are. And lastly, this is based on the external knowledge that we have gained throughout our life. That is what mind is for. It is always measuring, calculating, processing data, storing information, and it's largely based on the external experience of what we're observing and reflecting on. And this is calculated at the exact moment of birth. Okay. And so this is really the who we think we are. This is what we have conscious access to. This is what we are aware of. Whereas the design is subconscious and not always what we're aware of. And so these two aspects of us are really like the yin and yang of who we are, and they come together. They're like two strands, almost like the DNA helix. These two strands of information combine together with these 13 planetary activations. And when they synthesize in the totality of your design, that is the living, breathing essence that is you and your hologenetic blueprint. Now, each of those planetary activations is representing one of the 64 DNA codons that make up the genetic code. Okay. Now, when we look at how this corresponds to the I Ching has 64 hexagrams. And a hexagram is a grouping of 6 lines. Interestingly enough, a DNA codon is a grouping of 6 amino acids. Okay, so those 6 lines are symbolically the amino acids, and the 64 hexagrams are symbolically the 64 codons. Interestingly enough, when Watson and Crick cracked the genetic code back in the 40s, they did the human genome sequence. They discovered that verbatim, the I Ching is the human genome sequence in order from start to finish. So we finally got the technology to map the human genome, and lo and behold, right underneath our noses the entire time, one of the oldest written manuscripts on the planet was already laying out the human genome. all along. So these hexagrams represent the DNA, okay? And in the chart, they're corresponding to something called the gates. There's 64 gates. They're distributed amongst the 9 centers. And each of these gates has a line. There's 6 lines. There's these 6 archetypes that can express one of these, genetic characteristics that are the gates. So when you look at the columns of information and the planetary activations, you'll see the first number, which is the gate. Then you'll see a decimal point, and then another number, 1 through 6, that represents the line. Okay. And combined together, they are the unique expression and, archetypal message and embodiment that lives through you. So in this is an instance here, we see the 13 line 3. Well, how that relates is that Saturn placement is moving along the wheel, just like in traditional astrology, when you're looking at the ephemeris, that wheel there. And you'll see the planetary symbols and houses and how they're all connecting and their angles and aspects. Well, very similar in human design. A planet falls at a certain location in the chart, and now it's not just, sitting there in Aquarius, but it's now activating the 13th hexagram, which corresponds to that 13th gate in the chart. So when that planet falls on that 13, it actually defines that gate in the chart, which then colors it in the chart. You'll notice that there's black and red or black and red striped lines in your chart. Black is personality, red is design. Okay, so all of those lines in your chart, that's making the custom circuit board that is your human design. Now, what happens is when 2 of those gates touch and they link together, they form something called a channel. And this is what connects the 2 centers on either side of that channel. And it actually establishes and grounds the life force moving between those 2 centers. And that's actually what creates a consistent life force pattern through that channel. And each of those 36 channels, they have their own themes. And then based on the gates, whether they're planetary personality or design activations, and then the lines and the planet that's resting there, you get tons of variations of how the channel will express itself. And so what that creates is something called definition and openness. Everything that's colored in your chart, whether that's a center, a gate, or the entire channel, is considered defined. Everything that is defined, okay, is your reliable nature. It's something that you mastered in your last life and you brought into this life. That's kind of how I see it. And it's consistent from birth until death, okay? This reliable nature is establishing your influence on the environment and on others. And this is essentially what the Buddha referred to as your true self. This is how you live your design. This is how you were designed to live and embody and incarnate into this life. This is what is reliable that you can lean into. And this is your true self. Okay. Now, on the other side of that is the openness. Everything that's white in the chart that's not colored in is considered open. Okay. And this is really an inconsistent reflection because it's not something that's designed into you. It is inconsistent because the openness is actually a mirror. It's actually being influenced by the environment and by others in the environment. Even the planets themselves are influencing our openness. And what this does is it forms something called the not self. And this is basically a conglomerate of all of our external conditioning. Every time we encounter a very strong, pattern, it makes an imprint on us. It makes an impression. And sometimes it'll wear off at the end of the day. It'll wear off in a few weeks, if we spend a lot of time with that person, or if we spend years of our life, say with a parent, we get a strong imprint. And now we are reflecting a pattern that is theirs. It's not ours. And so what that creates is a distortion and suffering because we're choosing to make decisions or believe things that are not our beliefs and they're not our patterns. That's because the openness is the innocent child. That's kind of the way I see it. And this is what we're here to reclaim and reparent by doing this work. This is really, these are the little labyrinths that we journey into to do our shadow work and our healing by using our chart as a map rather than feeling around in the dark. We actually know where to go into the chart and excavate and unearth the conditioning and the beliefs and the patterns that aren't ours. We've just simply been reflecting them. And now, because we're aware of them, we have a choice. We can be awake in the light. We can be asleep in the light. We can be asleep in the dark. Or we can journey into our underworld with the awareness of our human design and become awake in the dark.